Okay, the Iran-Contra affair. Let me explain to you, as you can see here, looking at this graphic here. All right, Iraq starts the Iran-Contra affair. Again, this is an example. I could give you plenty of other examples. I can't do them all, but this is exemplary of Middle Eastern politics and those who get drawn into it, and how material incentives override political, cultural, religious, ethical, moral, anything else. All right. Material considerations here. Now, Iran starts the war, as I suggested, in 1980, Iraq starts the war in 1980, Saddam Hussein here, attacking Iran. Fine. Now, remember, Iran had just overthrown its U.S.-sponsored dictator, the Shah of Iran. We talked about that already. Just the previous year. Now, as I've indicated here, Iraq during this war used weapons of mass destruction on Iran. In fact, chemical weapons he used against Iranians, and killing thousands, especially young men wearing red bandanas who were attacking and defending against Saddam's, at the time, greater military capacity on the ground in terms of tanks. But another matter. Weapons of mass destruction were used by Iraq. Outraged, what occurred was that the Iranians went to the United Nations complaining about this. This was in 1982. And you could see that here. And the the United Nations was also outraged that Saddam here had used weapons of mass destruction. The Iranians pursued a resolution to condemn Iraq from, in response to its use of WMD. But the United States here was a key factor in voting down that resolution. For one thing, the United States was upset with Iran having got rid of its U.S.-sponsored dictator and, of course, having brought in a theocracy. But as I've indicated here, and as I've already mentioned, I believe previously, if not, I'll do so here, you got to remember that the United States supplied Iraq with the base stock for his weapons of mass destruction, his chemical weapons. In fact, this is a U.S. Senate document here reviewing the export of WMD to Iraq. All right. Now keep this in mind because you'll see the infinite ironies. Now, fine, we have a war on here between Iran and Iraq. Now, here's the problem that Iran has is outside of Saddam Hussein. All right. As you can see by this image here, Iran was looking over at the United States. The United States has an impressive military, bunch of ordnance and equipment that the United States would like to sell. And of course, Iran would like to buy this material to use in the war against Iraq. And you might say, well, why does Iran specifically interested in U.S. equipment? All right. Why is he specifically interested in U.S. equipment? You can get arms in the world markets, all kinds of arms. The reason why Iran was interested in getting U.S. equipment, because remember, Iran had just overthrown the Shah. And when the Shah of Iran was in power, he was a happy client of the United States, and therefore had purchased a whole series of U.S. weapons and equipment that needed U.S. parts. Thus, especially with respect to airplane parts, it was of particular importance. Therefore, at the outbreak of the war, The Iran-Iraq War, Iran had all U.S. military equipment and needed to get critical replacements, armaments, things like this. The only place you can get that was from the United States. But of course, the United States over here was mad at Iran for its revolution, and it would not sell it the weapons, at least openly. So Iran had to improvise and come up with a plan to urge the United States to sell it weaponry. And here's what the Iranians decided to do to get those. As you can see, and as I've indicated here, what they decided to do is you grab an American hostage from somewhere in the region. There's any number of opportunities. And they decided to hold that hostage. Where do you think they decided to hold them out? Well, as I put over here, in Lebanon. Why Lebanon? Why not in Iran? Well, Lebanon was a place, remember, as I told you to remember before, Lebanon was a country without a government after 1975. It was ideal to hold whatever nefarious activity you have going on, certainly hostage holding. You could easily hold them in Lebanon. There's going to be little interference with you because of the chaos already in the country. You could have an armed contingent there holding your hostages. And always keep in mind, Iran didn't want to hold the hostages within Iran because the previous year, Iran had held a bunch of hostages, I already talked about them, in the U.S. Embassy for 444 days at the time of the revolution. And the United States had responded by trying to militarily extract them. This was under the Carter administration. It failed. The rescue helicopters crashed in the desert. It was an embarrassment for the United States. In any case, Iran didn't want to invite the United States to militarily intervene in Iran directly. And plus, you don't want, if you're Iran, this sort of the obvious admission that you're hostage taking. So holding a hostage domestically would only encourage bad things for Iran. Better to hold them in a place like Lebanon and use Lebanon as sort of a filter of sorts. You could deny that you're behind the whole scheme by holding the hostage in Lebanon where there's nothing but chaos going on anyway. So what Iran was proposing was this, as you can see, and I've drawn up here. Iran is not just demanding, is wanting arms. Always keep in mind, Iran is willing to pay for these arms. It's just trying to coerce the United States to sell it arms, not to take hostage and trade the hostage directly. For arms, Iran is willing to pay. And of course, while the general public knew that hostages were being held in Lebanon, it did not know that Iran was looking to make a trade to actually pay for a hostage release if the United States would sell it weapons that it could use to defend against Iraq. Most people didn't know this at the time, that aspect of it. They knew that here was hostages being held in Lebanon, and that Iran was likely to be involved, although there was no direct evidence at the time. Now, the initial response by the United States is, as you can see here, President Ronald Reagan loudly stating that the United States, as you can read there, will never negotiate or give in to hostage takers or terrorists. Now, all leaders say things like that. It's rarely true. You make statements like that for public benefit, for domestic benefit at home. People like to hear that type of thing. They get all excited and they feel themselves to be particularly virtuous. All right, but it's rarely true. Everybody deals with hostage takers and terrorists. It's quite common. It's the norm. All right, you just don't say that. Remember, the public must be, I don't know, indulged and pandered to with the rhetoric that they like. Now, the United States administration, though, realized that there was benefits to be had from this if the money offer was kept secret, because nobody knew about the public didn't know about the money offer, only the stories every night about hostages. And I'll explain that in a minute. But what begins to happen is this. All right, fine. Here's what begins to happen. And yet the United States said publicly that it would not bargain for hostages. But what happened on the sly was the United States sent over an armed shipment, as you can see here, secretly sent over. It went to Iran. And then Iran, of course, told its people in Lebanon to release a hostage. And of course, when that hostage was released, nobody knew the quiet negotiations that were going on, not publicly or privately here. And so the result in the United States was something like this. All right. You get a hostage release, and then with the public, as I've written here, with the public unaware of the secret payments for weapons, the president of the U.S. gets to greet the freed hostages that were ostensibly freed because the United States had stood tall, had showed the fortitude of standing firm and resolute against terrorists. Fantastic. Very virtuous. Shows you the power of restraint and U.S. righteousness. And of course, Iran is happy with this deal over here because, look, Iranian leadership got its weapons, which it could use in its war against Saddam Hussein. Now, here's the problem. Fine, this was the Iran-Contra affair, and that was what was going on. All right? But as you can see here, well, fine, you made a shipment before, but at the end of the day, this war is going on for 8 years, you're going to be needing more shipment of U.S. arms. So what do you think Iran's going to do to get more arms? Well, I'm sure you're all well ahead of me. Boom, you take more hostages, and you hold them in Lebanon. You release them piecemeal as per an arms shipment. And think about it. Each time that hostage is released and heads home, you got the American public, all cheering and standing, whatever. These hostages were released. They'd come and get off the plane and they'd kiss American soil, and people would, get all excited because, again, all right. Notice again how the leadership of the United States and Iran very happy about this situation. This is working out fine. All right. Now, can you see where the problem is or was in this situation? Because, yeah, you can do this type of stuff. All right. Trading arms for hostages or this type of stuff. You're just going to encourage more hostage taking, but so what? All right. You get to profit from this type of deal. You get to sell some arms to Iran over here. You really don't want to do, but at the end of the day, this is politics. Can you see what the problem is? Something that's got to be dealt with so as to keep all this secret. Some of you might be ahead of me. And the problem is here, the money. What do you do with it? The U.S. administration can't officially report the money it got for the arms, because if it does, the accountants will have a large and recurring discrepancy that will give away the show. Accountants are accountants, folks. They deal in numbers, not heroic fantasies. That's for the public consumption. So, what do you do with the money? Well, here's what you do with the money. You don't report it. The money was used to fund, you send the money down to Central America, specifically to, well, put it this way. Here's what happened the same year that Iran got got rid of its U.S.-sponsored dictator. Nicaragua did the same thing. It got rid of the dictatorship of a fellow by the name of Anastasio Somoza, another crooked dictator who owned much of the economy himself, all right? And he ran the country brutally with his police force called the Guardia Nacional, whatever, the National Guard, all right? Well, he got thrown out in 1979. And therefore, his National Guard was funded by the United States and Honduras. They assembled in Honduras the National Guard, and the United States funded them with this unreported money their names were changed to be called the people against the new government, which was the Sandinistas, and they were called the Contras, which you can see here, the ousted National Guard of Nicaragua. That's what was done. This was called the Iran-Contra affair, folks. Type it into the web and get all the facts. When this got out, because this act here of funding a war extra without the sanction of the government or the the legislative branch was against what was referred to as the Boland Amendment. Let's not worry about the fineries of it. All right, but when this got out, it locked up President Reagan's administration because it was, of course, unethical and illegal and problematic, and it compromised any number of values, ethics, so-called stated public positions of the United States. His presidency was locked up for about a year and a half or so. A number of people went to jail. There was talk of impeachment of Reagan, but it didn't happen. Please type that into the web, folks, and get all the facts. The Iran-Contra affair. Those who will say, well, the principal reason for all this was to get the money to fund, without the sanction of Congress, to fund this war down over here. With same difference. Either way, you're profiting from this whole thing in terms of the political benefits of being seen to be standing up to hostage takers or whatever. But it just shows you at the end of the day, this is called realpolitik, all right, real politics, practical international politics, all that public statement stuff and whatever. That's all applause lines for the general public. In any case. All right. A good example of the sophisticated politics of the region. I could give you many more. Let's get back to the Iran-Iraq War. All right. The Iran-Iraq War, by the way, ended in 1988, where the UN negotiated a ceasefire. But although technically it was a ceasefire, however deadly, Iran must be considered victorious, right? Because it was attacked and it succeeded in defending its territory and resources. So at the end of the day, you have to say that Iran was successful, however bloody this war was. And the loss of life was, of course, tragic. But nevertheless, Iran did prevail politically. Saddam of Iraq here had failed. He'd failed. He saw an opportunity there with a new U.S. Antagonist or enemy, and then he went in there to get that oil, and he failed. So let's see what his response is going to be, not but 2 years later. All right, a little less than 2 years, actually. He'd failed here to go in Iraq, so he does this. He goes, I'll attack Kuwait. Kuwait is another country, of course, that has a lot of oil up underneath it. And whereupon the United States sort of passively, or less than passively, supported Iraq's attack on Iran, then supported Iran's getting weaponry, causing, essentially the United States had supported both sides in the Iran-Iraq war. With Saddam's attack on Kuwait, that was outrageous to the United States because Kuwait was a good U.S. ally. Remember, the important thing for the outside powers is to have good, compliant allied states in the region. Cared little about their politics or ideology, religion or anything else. Well, Kuwait was a U.S. ally. And therefore, the United States was worried that, look, if Saddam was to take over Kuwait, which he did, who knows, he might not stop there. He may go into Saudi Arabia, another even bigger U.S. ally with a lot more oil. And do you want to give an individual like Saddam, who's increasingly being seen as a loose cannon, control of more and more of international oil? Okay. At this point, when Saddam attacks in 1990 a U.S. ally, Saddam had to be stopped from the United States point of view. I mean, you got those oil fields in Saudi Arabia right next door, and this had to be stopped at this point. And what the United States does, which you should already know, is the United States organized a bunch of coalition forces called in an attack to free Kuwait called Operation Desert Storm in 1991. The reasons the United States said that Saddam had to be thrown out of Kuwait is because Saddam was a dictatorial beast. Well, he was. But nobody had any problem with him being a dictatorial beast as long as he was a compliant and he worked with foreign initiatives in the region. There's plenty of dictatorial beasts which are allies. There's not a problem there, but of course you're selling it to the public. The United States also said that UN resolutions had to be backed up. In fact, I'll put up a graphic here in a bit to show you all the reasons it was put up. Well, actually, whatever. The United States said Kuwait deserved freedom rather than being consigned to a dictatorship. The fact that Kuwait itself is a monarchy escaped many people's observation. Make a long story short, you know what happened here. Saddam was easily kicked out of Kuwait. It was a wipeout. Saddam's forces were easily pushed out of Kuwait. In fact, this terrain is the perfect terrain for a high-tech U.S. military, especially with an excellent air force. And you were able to really just wipe out Saddam's completely exposed to the military might of the United States in this environment. It's entirely different in Afghanistan, by the way, but that's another matter. Let's stick with Kuwait. In fact, the United States lost more troops to friendly fire than it did to Iraqi resistance. Now, what few people took note of, I remember this specifically because I pointed this out to the ire of many of my people around. I believe I was in grad school or something. Here's what occurred right after the end of this war. There was a lot of triumphalism in the West, in the United States specifically. The United States, having freed Kuwait, having gotten rid of the dictator, and having spilled blood, not a lot of its own, the U.S. reinstalled the autocratic leadership of the al-Sabah clan who ran the country. Despite advocating against dictatorship, and despite advocating for democracy, and despite having spilt U.S. blood in this war, the U.S., in full occupation of the country, did not install a democracy. Why? Because the al-Sabah monarchy was a U.S. ally. And like the Saudis, they released oil on the market in keeping with U.S. economic needs. Why gamble on what a democracy might do? Democracies can be changeable. You saw what the Iranian democracy did when it came into power in 1951, and they were suddenly asking for a greater cut of their national resources. No, better to support a dictator. All right, now that leads to more problems. It's one long continuing narrative of contradictions. The problem for the United States is, having kicked out Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, what do you do now? Do you stop at the Kuwaiti border and say, fine, we've freed Kuwait? Or do you go all the way into Iraq and knock out the Saddam Hussein's regime, now that he become a loose cannon? All right. That was a tough decision, and a lot of people had a lot to say about it. And we'll talk about what decision the United States decided to take in 1991 that would resonate a few years later in 2003.